Nowadays, it's common for games to receive system updates, whether it's to patch glitches or to add new content. But believe it or not, retro games also received system updates, just not in the conventional form. Most people know that Super Mario Bros. 3 had a Japanese and US version that were different, but there's actually a third version of the game. Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Alright, so if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. And check out our Discord server, discord.podrez.net. Alright, let's talk about some retro games that received system updates. It might seem strange that retro games have had revisions. Normally a system update would be passed through an internet connection, but back then that obviously wasn't the case. Instead, there would just be 2 or more versions of a game. The cartridges would look exactly the same most of the time, but the code inside of the later version of the game would be updated. There's a few common situations where this happens. A lot of the times when a game gets released in a different region, that's an opportunity for the developers to make any changes. You'll see a lot of international games receive some tiny changes. Sometimes if a game gets released on a collection, you may see some small changes for varying reasons. As you might imagine, this is not the most efficient way to send out a system update. Generally, if you're making a patch to a game, you don't want people to keep the original version anymore. But if it's in a cartridge form, there's no way to update that. Remember that infinite jump glitch that was in Sonic Boom? That was a huge technical flaw, but thankfully a patch fixed it. Imagine if this were a retro game that you couldn't just send an update to. Developers really had to be careful back then to make sure their games were well made. With that said, I thought it would be cool to look at a few examples of games that have revisions. I want to give a shout out to the cutting room floor for making this video easier to research for. For those who don't know, this website shows unused content, revisions, and prototype information for various games. Anyway, let's get started. Number 1. Sonic Boom wasn't the only game to have revisions. Even the classic Sonic games had different versions. We'll start off with Sonic 1. This game initially came out in the US, but then was released in Japan a month later. This is unusual. You normally see games get released in Japan first. The original US version, which is Revision 0, is a perfectly fine game that didn't need to be updated, but within that month in between the US and Japanese release, Sega felt like a little more polish could have been added. For one, the Japanese version, which is called Revision 1, has a few extra layers of parallax scrolling on some levels. The water in Labyrinth Zone now has a ripple effect, which was not the case in the US version. The level select has also been changed. Now the stages are all in order. I always thought it was strange that the US version didn't have the stages in the correct order. In general, the code in Revision 1 is much cleaner and more efficient than Revision 0. Even though it was only released in Japan, Revision 1 would be included in future compilations, even in the US. Of course, Sega is going to include the more updated version on compilations. Oddly though, Virtual Console would receive Revision 0. Not sure why they did that. Overall, it's cool to see that Sega added just a little bit more polish to an already great game. Number 2. While we're on the topic of Sonic, the second game also had a few revisions. These ones are a bit more noticeable than the original game. Here's a question: do you see a difference between these 2 signposts? I don't blame you. In Revision 0, the signpost is a little bit too far into the ground and you can just barely see the bottom of it. In Revision 1, it was correctly placed. There's also a minor level modification in Casino Night Zone, but only in 2-player mode. In Revision 0, the flipper is on the right of the 2 bumpers, but in Revision 1, it was moved above, right near the slot machine. Revision 1 only fixed a few very small glitches, but otherwise is the exact same game. Revision 2, on the other hand, made some noticeable changes. In the previous versions, when you're on Sky Chase Zone, you're able to spin dash off the tornado, but in Revision 2, it was fixed so that you're always on top of the plane, no matter what. They also fixed a massive glitch with Supersonic. In the original game, if you jumped after you completed a stage, you would be stuck in the air and the game would soft lock. This is a very easy glitch to pull off, and insane that it was not caught before release. Not even Revision 1 fixed this problem. It wasn't until Revision 2 did the glitch finally get patched. This one particular bug is a good example of how nice patch updates are today. The developers definitely would have patched all copies of this game if it happened today, but because it didn't, there's thousands of copies of this game that still have the bug. Revision 2 was included in the Sonic Classics cartridge, which has multiple Sonic games on it, but never received a standalone release on the Genesis. It would be included in many compilations, but sometimes Sega would mess up. In Sonic Mega Collection, for whatever reason, they included Revision 1, which still has a tornado and supersonic glitch. Weird. Number 3. The Sega Genesis originally had a hard time competing against Nintendo. Despite the NES being inferior in hardware, the lineup of games was far better. Sega tried keeping the Genesis relevant by obtaining licenses to celebrities and well-known arcade titles, but there is one game that really made the console look strong: Revenge of Shinobi. It's a basic platformer. You can throw shurikens, but you have a limited number of them. You can perform a double jump, and you have a special attack that grants you an ability, whether it's a barrier that protects your character or an attack that kills everything on screen. The game has a lot of variety. In one stage, you're on a subway and you must avoid the hazardous ceilings that are coming from the right. In some stages, there's a foreground and background section that you can double jump between. The graphics are also phenomenal, and the music is some of the best on the Genesis. The game is extremely difficult. You really have to know where the shuriken upgrades are because you run out very quickly. The stages where you can jump between the foreground and background can be very confusing, but still, this is a fantastic game. In the original version, also called Revision 0, Sega took a huge risk. They added a bunch of characters that they didn't have the rights to, like an enemy that strongly resembles Rambo. There's a stage boss that resembles Spider-Man, and once you defeat him, he transforms into Batman. Another boss looks identical to Godzilla, as well as one that closer resembles the Terminator. Wow, don't you think they went a little overkill here? Sega quickly realized they made a mistake by adding these characters and would make 5 revisions to the game. Why so many? Revision 1 replaced Batman with a character that's different enough to avoid copyright issues. Rambo also shaved his head in this revision. Revision 2 has an interesting change. Sega was actually able to obtain the rights to Spider-Man, so now he's really Spider-Man this time, rather than just a character that resembles him. There's also a copyright notice at the beginning that acknowledges this. Revision 3 was only released on the 6-pack cartridge. This one only made one change, and that was to Godzilla. Now he's just a skeleton. The game would also receive one more revision, but that was many years later on Virtual Console. To really play it safe, Spider-Man was colored in pink since Sega no longer had the rights to the character. Oddly, the Terminator was never changed in any of the revisions. I'm not sure why they changed the others, but not him. It's amazing to think that the original game had 4 different superhero characters without authorization. Number 4. With the holidays right around the corner, I figured I'd talk about Home Alone on the NES. You play as Kevin, and you must stay away from Harry and Marv. If you avoid them for 20 minutes, you win. There's traps you can set that will temporarily stun them. This will buy time and allow you to pass through them without getting hit. You can carry more than 1 trap at a time, but no more than 3. The best strategy is to hide in the treehouse because Harry and Marv take a long time to find you there. The scrolling is really weird in this game. Kevin is always centered in a weird spot, whether it's too far to the right, too far to the left, or too high up. Not only is this bad programming, but it makes it really hard to see around you when the screen is not centered right. There's very little content in this game too. For one, this is not a big level, it's just the McAllister residence and the treehouse. If you last 20 minutes, that's it. You beat the game. You don't move on to level 2. There's not even a way to change the difficulty or increase the amount of time. Once you beat it the first time, there's not much reason to come back to it. It's not like you can do a speed run or anything. It's a unique game, but there's not much to it. Surprisingly, this very short game has 2 versions, and they only made one bizarre change. When you're caught by Harry or Marv, you're brought to a screen that has Kevin's classic face from the movie. Seems fine, but for whatever reason, in the second version of the game, they replaced Kevin with a cloud. Why would they do this? I'm trying to think maybe copyright reasons, but they already have the Home Alone license. Did Kevin's face cost extra? Number 5. Super Mario Bros. 3 is one of the many NES games to use the MMC3 chip, and it's obvious when playing. It's a massive game. Not only are there 8 worlds, but each one has its own level map with new graphics. The levels are also massive for NES standards, and many of them scroll in multiple directions, which was uncommon for the NES. It's also fun to play, and you get so much content for a single game. This is easily one of the best titles ever made of all time. I'm not even just talking about the NES. There was about a 1.5 year gap between the US and Japanese release, and this allowed Nintendo to tinker with the game a little. There's a few aesthetic differences in the Japanese version. When beginning a stage, there's an extra animation that plays out. In the US version, you do get that animation on the map screen, but that's it. The King's Chamber looks a lot different than it does in the US version. They also made some tiny changes to the levels. The very end of the first fortress level looks different in each version. The US one is a bit easier. In 5-1, in order to end the level, you have to enter a pipe. From there, once you exit, you can proceed to finish the stage. But in the US version, you don't have to enter a pipe, you can just walk to the right. Outside of 2 or 3 changes altogether, most of the levels are identical in both versions. The biggest change they made though is what happens when Mario gets hit. In the Japanese version, Mario always turns small, regardless of what power-up he has. But in the US version, if you have Raccoon or Fire Mario, you turn back into regular Mario. This essentially gives you an extra hit compared to the Japanese version. These changes make the US version easier overall. Most of us probably already know about these changes, but there's actually one more version of Super Mario Bros. 3 that isn't talked about. The US received 2 revisions. Sadly, the only changes they made are to the text. In the bonus level, the original version says miss twice and you're out, but uses the wrong you're. Revision 1 changes the text to you can only miss twice, which doesn't have any grammar errors. They also changed the name of the worlds when you reach the ending. The original version had more creative names like Desert Hill, Oceanside, and Pipe Maze, while Revision 1 changes everything to more generic ones. Desert Land, Waterland, Giant Land, and so on. Everything ends in the word land. I'm not sure why they made this change. The gameplay was not changed at all in Revision 1. While the Japanese to US changes were very interesting, the Revision 0 to 1 changes were lame. It's no wonder people may not know about this version. I just wanted to give you a few examples of games that have been revised. You would think revisions didn't happen with retro games, but it actually did. Did any of these revisions surprise you? I'm personally surprised by the Home Alone one simply because it was so unnecessary. Let me know in the comments if there's any games I didn't mention or if there's anything I missed. Thank you for watching. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.